Good morning. It is Friday, the 23rd of September. In the biblical record, and we're looking and continue to look at the book of Esther, but in the biblical record in the Old Testament, the Amalekite people group and the Jewish people group were always at some form of loggerhead with one another. There was a kind of mutual enmity and hatred between them. The Jewish record records that the Amalekites were the first people to attack the Jews in their exodus, and they persisted in their attacking and their desire to destroy the Jews. And so very often for the Jews, their enemies could be described as being Amalekites, because these were people constantly threatening them. Now, the story of Esther picks up on this theme. And so at first, although it may look as if it's one little story to do with one little Jewish family, it quickly escalates and it becomes the Amalekites once again attacking the Jews throughout the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. And the senior Amalekite man, Haman, gains the favor of the king, and the senior Jewish man in the story is Mordecai, and they work quietly in faith and with much prayer to work against this. And it is Esther, a Jewess, who becomes the queen, who is the pivot upon which everything turns. And in chapter 6, the whole story comes to some kind of a climax, and the following chapters 7, 8, and 9 all bring it to a close. And today we look at chapter 8, and it'll be our final look because over the weekend we move on to a different book in the liturgy. So in chapter 8, we pick up the story where Haman has been hanged on the gallows, and Esther and the king are happy that all of this has been solved, and Esther brings it to the king's attention that she is herself a Jew. Yes, she had already referenced that, but also references that Mordecai is her uncle, and of course Mordecai is this very special person. And so the king takes Mordecai and puts him into Haman's position, and he gives authority for Haman to issue an edict that no more are the Jews to be attacked. And in fact, Mordecai takes that a step further, and this is what we don't read because the readings in the lectionary have stopped, but just as a little bit of further of the background, Mordecai issues an edict to the Jews that on a particular time, some 8 months later, the Jews are now permitted, in fact, to attack those who are attacking them. Not too sure if it's because the attack of the Amalekites continued, or whether the Jews just had now the authority to go and attack those who were actively persecuting them. And so that happens, and that sets up the celebration of the Jews. It takes that attack against the Amalekites and those threatening the Jews takes place approximately over 2 days. As I said, some 8 months after this edict is issued. And on the third day, it is then said that the Jews celebrate for 2 days, the celebration which is still happening to this day of Purim, where they celebrate the word Purim based on the word Pur, which is the lot that had been cast against the Jews has now been overturned. So the book really is saying to us that if we follow God and obey God and are faithful to God, God's enemies will be defeated. The Jews had seen themselves, and the Old Testament scripture describes this as being the Jews are the chosen people of God, not to be set apart and to somehow lord it over others, but to be an example to others of the existence of God. And you get a sense of that in scripture. In Esther, where we are told many people became Jews because they realized just how powerful the Jewish God is. So even for us today, as Christians, if we obey God and are faithful to him, God will continue to protect and guide us. And there is a sense in which as Christians, we are very often a persecuted people. And we see that especially happening in this more modern day and era, where people almost mock you because you go to church and because you operate, and we ought to be operating according to ethics and morals in the world. So we must remember that we must always obey God and follow him and serve him, and at the end of the day, God will always protect us, just as he did Esther and Mordecai and all the Jews. Folks, have a wonderful weekend, and we'll chat again next week. I may be a little bit late at times, if at all, because I have meetings the whole of next week, so I suspect I'm not going to be able to give my little talk. My apologies for that, and I'll pick it up as soon as all of these meetings are over. It's going to be a week plus some extra time. God bless. Have a good weekend.